Smriti ma'am, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, so we can start, right?
Yep. If
So,
everybody
a
is
hearty
ready.
good afternoon to all. Welcome to our ninth session. Today we are having Smriti ma'am taking a topic on grief. So, we can start with ma'am's presentation. We can have her presentation for around 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a 50 minutes of discussion. We can start our case presentation by 4 o'clock, followed by its discussion. We can wind up our session by 4:30. So, over to Vaishnavi.
Thank you, Raju, for explaining all those regular instructions. And welcome back, Smriti ma'am. So nice to see you again in Psychosocial Echo. And hope the participants is very well known with Smriti Rana. Even she don't need any kind of introduction. I would like to say she is also holding her MSc in Integrative and Holistic Psychological Counseling. So over to the session on grief.
Thank you. Thanks, Vaishnavi and Raju. Nice to see everybody again. On the outset, I want to say that grief is such a huge subject, and 1.5 hours is not even scratching the surface. And I think it would take a lifetime to really study it. But I'm going to do my best to take you through what I think are some of the most basic and probably the most applicable things for us as we go along now in our practice. Of course, I will encourage you to do your own research, and there's plenty of literature out there on all the aspects that I'm going to talk about today. And of course, if after the session, if anyone has any particular questions, you can always contact me and we can take it offline. So I'm going to be sharing my screen, Raju, now. Is this visible to everyone?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Okay. So grief, to begin with, is really about loss, and we grieve when we lose something or someone, and it is undeniably associated with the loss of something. Now, because in palliative care we look at it from the point of view of not just the patient but also the family, I'm just going to very quickly take you through some of the losses that are experienced both on a personal level by the patient as well as those losses that are experienced by the family as a unit. For the patient, one of the first things that you lose once you've been diagnosed with an illness is a sense of control. And sense of control could be, so often I've met families where the person who's been sick has been someone who's always been in control of their lives, or they know what their plans are, what's going to happen next, what they've decided for the next 5 years, and so on and so forth. But with the diagnosis of illness, suddenly all those plans are out the window, and there's a huge sense of loss of control. Very closely tied to control is the idea of autonomy. Now, but there's also a clear distinction here, and I know that all of us are very familiar with the medical ethics, and autonomy is one of that. Autonomy, I want to just take a little bit more time to explain that autonomy is a sense of, it's not just control, it's so much more than that. Self-determination, the ability to make decisions for yourself that impact your own life and the lives around you, or your own career path or your own life path, in a sense. And very often, once a patient is diagnosed with an illness, that's one of the first things that's taken away from them. Suddenly, it's the family and the healthcare providers and everybody else that's making decisions for them. And very rarely do we find a family that is so involved, or evolved rather, that brings in that patient right from the start to say, hey, you know what, we're going to have you on board with us right through. This is your body, this is your mind, and we need you to make your decisions as well. So autonomy also, I want to emphasize, can be exercised by a person who is fully physically dependent. Even somebody who is completely paralyzed can still have a sense of autonomy if the people around him or her allow him to have it. I think, for example, the most a celebrated person would be Stephen Hawking, the theorist, who wrote books about the cosmos, even though he had, he was fully physically dependent. So autonomy is a very important thing, and I don't think we can understate that. Health, of course. what is health? Now, if we've all gone over the WHO explanation of health hundreds of times, it's not just the absence of disease, but it's also the presence of well-being. And illness will do that to you. It'll take away your sense of well-being. So health in that context, the holistic idea of health is lost. In some cases, mental function is affected. And as some of us probably know, the loss of your ability to cognitively process information, or to even be able to make decisions for yourself. I mean, and that's different from autonomy. The loss of mental function, the ability to remember things, like, for example, Alzheimer's, things like that. So the loss of mental function is a loss that is experienced in some cases. Physical function, of course, as the disease progresses, people lose mobility. They might lose the use of a limb. They might lose the use of an organ. Sometimes it has to be supported. Sometimes they lose the ability to walk. So physical function is affected and impacted and lost in a lot of cases. And of course, social roles and responsibilities. Somebody who was the breadwinner is now no longer the breadwinner. The mother who might have been the heart and soul of the family, who makes sure that everybody is fed and taken care of, and all of those roles that she defines herself by, that might be lost because she is now confined to a wheelchair or a bed, or confined to within her home. Your responsibility as a member of society also sometimes is lost. You're no longer able to go to work. And if I were to pose this question to all of you today, who are you? Who are you? Like, apart from your name, tell me about yourself. Who are you? I'm pretty certain that a vast majority of you would answer with some of the roles and responsibilities that you fulfill in society. And that is lost. When you're no longer able to go out there and do that, you really lose a large part of who you really are as a person and who you define yourself as. And of course, dignity. I'm sure Seema Rao's session must have touched upon that quite a bit. And I mean, I personally feel that, dignity is like the word love or joy. It's something that is important to all of us. We all know that dignity is important, but what it means to different people is different things. And dignity is something that, we all talk about, but unfortunately, it's one of the biggest collateral damages when it comes to being diagnosed with an illness. And sometimes the indignity is inflicted on that person by the healthcare system. And we play a huge role in taking somebody's dignity away. A simple example is when in teaching hospitals, someone might be lying in bed with a catheter, and then there comes the grand rounds with the doctor, with all the students, with various other visitors. And without even thinking about it, you take the bed sheet off the person, you change the catheter in front of 12 people, and that's it. You just take away somebody's dignity. Other ways in which people lose their dignity is by not being asked what they want, what is important to them, what brings meaning to them. And decisions are made for them. And even children, I want to emphasize, have a sense of dignity, which we overlook a lot. And we'll be talking about children in a session further down the line. And of course, time. All those plans that they have for their future, all the things that they'd like to do. One is time in the concept of the future and things that they won't be able to do anymore. But also a lot of time is lost in just dealing with the illness. Hospital visits, planning appointments, going for treatment, recovering from chemotherapy. That takes days. Just that much time that otherwise would have been spent doing so many other things with family, with professional roles, so on, is all gone. So time is a huge loss. And I know that everything that is on this screen right now are very, very obvious things, but sometimes the obvious has to be stated. So these are the things that the patient possibly loses, but the family also loses many things. First, again, control. As a family, everything gets disrupted. They no longer have control over what the family as a unit is going to be able to do. And especially when it is the breadwinner that has fallen sick, there's a lot of other control that is lost, right? A person who's never had to look into the accounts and the finances of the family is suddenly in charge, and there's a huge sense of, oh gosh, I don't know how to do this, and that sense of panic sort of sets in. Very often, if the person who is ill and is no longer able to speak and was in charge of all the financial decisions and so on and so forth, is no longer there to guide you. And there are so many families we've met who, after the person has passed away, they realize that they've inherited so much debt, they've inherited so many other liabilities which they didn't know about, and that again spins their lives out of control. So control again means many, many things. A functioning member of the family. Even within our families, we all perform a certain function, correct? So a daughter might have a certain function, a parent has a function, a grandparent has a function, and suddenly that functioning member is no longer able to perform those functions, and that's a huge sort of void that comes into the family system. A sense of normalcy, and the disease or the illness takes over the family's entire life. Nothing seems normal anymore, I mean, and this is especially true in the acute stages or at breakpoint stages where bad news is first received, or you were hoping for a remission but instead there's a relapse, and nothing is normal anymore. Even the way you talk to one another maybe have now just goes into conversations about the person's health issues, or how we're going to make up for that person not being able to do what they were always doing, so on. And so the sense of normalcy is gone. And of course, when you lose control, when you lose a sense of normalcy, stability is shaken. And I have to mention here that families that had issues amongst themselves to begin with, these issues only become greater after there's a health crisis. If a family was a cohesive family, even prior to the illness, with open lines of communication with one another and all that, that stability can still sort of be reined in. But in families that were sort of dysfunctional even before the illness came in, the stability is even more worsened. And of course, just like the patient loses time, so does the family. And the primary caregiver especially will be the one who bears the brunt of this. Suddenly, they are involved in all kinds of direct and indirect care. Now, direct care is what you do for the patient, right? Clean them up, prop them up in the pillow, make sure that they're fed, make sure that they're taking their medicines, all of that. But indirect care is stuff that you do on behalf of the patient, like, going across to the bank, getting bank work done for them, making appointments for them. So again, there's a time shrinkage, so to speak, that happens for the family as well. And of course, the family also has to rearrange itself around the illness. Someone who was really looking forward to going to a college, and the family was saving up for that education, suddenly has to reallocate those funds. And it doesn't even have to be something like college. I mean, if you look at some of the patients that a lot of us encounter, just the treatment cost will cause reallocation of funds. So what was earlier being spent on the child's tuition is now going for the treatment, and the child's education might come to a standstill. So there are various things in ways in which losses are experienced, and there is grief that is associated with every single one of these losses. Okay. So that's as far as losses are concerned. Grief is not just a simple emotional response. I mean, when we talk about grief, we think about sadness, but it is a little bit more complicated than just feeling sad about something happening. Grief is really a total human experience. And when I say total human experience, I mean that in every possible context. Grief is experienced at a personal level. If someone in my family is sick, how I experience grief will be different from somebody else in the family who experiences grief. A spouse will experience grief differently from a child. A sibling will experience grief differently from a grandparent. So there are personal components to how grief is experienced. And for some people, they're more affected than others. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It's also experienced at a social level. When a family is grieving or is going through a process of illness and just dealing with the illness, it affects their social fabric, how they connect with their society around them, how society views them. And, in certain cases like HIV and leprosy and so on and so forth, the family as a whole might be stigmatized, right? And all those social connections are lost because something like that is happening in your family to someone that you love very much. So the grief could also mean you're grieving for the person who's experiencing it, but you're also grieving for the losses that you're feeling on a social level, right? Grief is felt physically. Now, if I ask you to think about it, where do you experience grief? Which part of your body do you experience grief in? And I'm happy to have, if somebody has an answer to that, I'm happy to take it, because it is felt at a physical level as well. And I'm not talking about the more cerebral, mental aspects. I'm talking about physically in your body. Where do you experience grief?
Anyone wish to say something? Bandana?
We can move along, and if you want to add something later, we can come back to that. Okay, because
Okay.
I understand we might be a little short on time. I would say that, a lot of people feel it in their chest. The heaviness in your chest, the tightness in your chest. People have difficulty breathing when they're feeling really, really sad, or they have a hard time catching their breath. Some people feel it in their stomachs, and you feel spasms in your stomach. Some people feel grief on their shoulders, because like as if they're carrying a burden. So pay attention to the physical aspects of grief as much as you would to the emotional aspects. Sorry, I've lost there it is. Cognitive aspects, of course, you feel it in your mind. You might go over the same scenario over and over again. It makes you think about what you could have done differently, or how you can do something now to make it better. So it really occupies a lot of your mind space as well as you go along. Emotionally, of course, I think this is something that most of us really associate grief with: emotionality, the feelings that accompany grief. And of course, grief has a very deep spiritual component. And when I say spiritual, I don't just mean religious. I mean your sense of meaning and what connects you to the world around you. Sometimes the grief comes from the fact that, this is such a good person. Why is this happening to them? It really shakes your faith in the goodness that you believed in earlier. Or spiritually, it might be that, somebody might have a deep connection with music, or they could be a musician, or they could be an artist, and suddenly they can't do all of that. And that connectedness that they feel with the universe around them through their art, through their music, through their work, all of that is also lost. So it's also, and then there's an existential void that comes in. So grief is really experienced in all these different domains, and is not just a simple human emotional reaction. It's actually all of these things that come into grief. And there's enough literature to support each of these dimensions that I've pulled up on the screen right now. I think this is the most famous explanation of grief that we all know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, which very quickly are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. While this is the most world-famous theory, today it has been debunked in the sense that it does not typically happen in this fashion. You do not progress in a linear fashion from denial to anger, anger to bargaining. You could very well go from denial to acceptance, but then very often something will happen and then you go right back to denial. Anger can even follow acceptance. You can have accepted the prognosis, but you can still be angry about it. Depression, I'm going to talk about depression a little bit further. And bargaining, okay, if I can just live to see my daughter getting married, I promise that I will do this. Bargaining with God, bargaining with whoever you believe in is involved. And this is the typical 5 stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about. But I want to take you beyond this. And while this was a beautiful theory when it first came out, because nobody was really studying the process of grief as much as she was, we have since this theory came out, we've progressed quite a bit. One of the statements that I'd like to make here, of course, is that the nature of grief is relational. What does that mean? That grief is basically not experienced in isolation. And the nature of grief is that it relates to something. It relates to someone or something in your life. Now, just very quickly, this is a study that was done by Given and Farrell in the years 89 and 91. Of course, there have been studies after that as well. But their findings, which were seminal at the time, was that 70% of carers are spouses, 20% are children, and 10% are friends or distant relatives. To this statistic, I want to add that today we know that globally 80% of caregivers are women. And that's an important statistic to remember in terms of just gender inequity in healthcare. So these are just some statistics. So let me take you further to systems theory. Systems theory is again a rather complicated and complex. Well, it's not complicated as much as it's complex and layered. And so I'm not going to get into the details of it. But systems theory by Murray and Bowen typically just talks about the family as a unit. And they believe that if you want to observe or provide therapy to somebody, you have to look at you have to look at the unit that they form a part of, and you have to look at the whole system that they're part of, because nobody, I mean, there's an old saying that no man is an island, and that's pretty much true. Individuals cannot be understood in isolation from one another, but rather as part of their family. Now, this applies even to people who come from broken families. This doesn't mean that you have to only look at families that are cohesive and living together and, are talking to each other on a regular basis. The absence of a family unit also impacts the way a person experiences life. And sometimes that absence is more conspicuous than the people who are actually around them in their immediate surroundings. So the systems theory looks at the system, even though the components may not be physically present in front of you. Change in one part of the system inevitably affects other parts over time. This is another tenet of systems theory. And here, probably you could imagine this as, a car. If one part of the car fails, the car is not going to run, right? If you have a flat tire, you're not going to be able to drive that car. Or if your battery is down, you're not going to be able to start it. So change in one part of the system inevitably affects other parts over time. So if there is individual trauma that has happened in the family, that trauma, whether it's an illness, whether it's abuse, whether it's anything, is going to affect the family system over time. So you have to look at it as a whole. And there are reciprocal influences and interdependence. So when something happens to one person in the family or in a system, it is bound to have an impact on another part of the family or on the family as a whole. And similarly, if something happens somewhere else, it's going to affect me. If my brother has been in an accident, it's going to affect the way I function. I mean, it's not just going to affect the way I see him or feel about him. It's going to have an effect on how I deal with the rest of the world as well. And there is an interdependence that comes in a family unit. So if you identify somebody who is grieving, you have to look at the system as a whole and see where else solutions can be found. Sometimes the solution is not found within the person that you're individually dealing with, but the solution may very well come from another part of the system. And that's typically what the systems theory talks about. There are several factors, of course, that influence grief and how it is experienced. So I'm just going to take you through some of the more major ones. I have to put in a cautionary note. Of course, there's each of these things that I'm talking about. There is vast literature, again, on each of these points. And if any of them strikes you as being significantly relevant to some of the work that you're doing, I'm going to encourage you to explore that further. For me personally, with my experience in training, one thing that has resonated with me a lot is attachment styles. There's a whole field of psychology dedicated to attachment theories and disorders. And there are many, many researchers who've dedicated their lives just studying how people attach themselves to significant people in their lives. And one of one of the authors that I particularly like is Mary Ainsworth. And so basically, the attachment theory talks about how human beings, when they are at their earliest years, how they attach themselves to their primary caregivers and their significant adults determines how they will behave for the rest of their lives. And it will very, very sharply come into focus at the time of bereavement and grief. So if somebody is securely attached and there's a reciprocity in the relationship that is healthy and so on, there, even at the time of death or at the time of severe illness, they are likely to cope better than if somebody who has gone through what, for example, is called anxious and ambivalent style of attachment, where the primary caregiver, it could have been the mother or it could have been someone else, is overprotective, very controlling, an anxious person themselves. That child learns those patterns themselves. And when illness happens or when death happens, that sort of really clinging sort of relationship between the two of them complicates the grieving and the bereavement process that much more. So attachment styles are very important. And if some of you are involved in deeper work with your patients, with the families, even after bereavement, then this is something that you should definitely look into. The way a family is structured. Now, I don't mean dynamics. I clearly mean structure. This is again part of systems theory, which tells you that even within families, there are subgroups, there are alliances, there are certain people who are closer to one another than to other people in the family. Sometimes if the parents are, not getting along, the children might become a little unit by themselves, where they become sort of, they cling to each other for comfort. This is especially true in sort of, families where there's violence and so on. Sometimes if, again, to take another negative example, if there is a lot of conflict between the parents might align themselves to the children to try and use them in their dynamic. And that becomes a different kind of unhealthy alliance or a subgroup. Boundaries really talks about, all of us have boundaries as people, not just as a family, but even as individuals. Some boundaries are porous, especially with people closest to you. You might, share a lot more than an acquaintance or a stranger. With some people, your boundaries are very, very strong. With some people, your boundaries are unhealthy. And again, if your attachment style has been strange or difficult as a child, you're likely to have very unclear boundaries with other adults and other significant people in your lives when you grow up. And flexibility. How flexible is a family? Flexibility also lends itself to resilience. If a family is able to adapt to stressors and to crisis, they're more likely to cope better with changes, especially changes that they did not foresee. And so they're able to deal with grief also in a much healthier way. Communication patterns within the family is the dynamics. And under communication patterns, there's decision-making patterns. Who makes the decision in the family? In some cases, it's the person who controls the money. They get to make the decision. This is an example that I've probably stated somewhere else before, but you might have a family here in Kerala that is dealing with an illness, and the primary caregiver is the woman who's coming to you and talking to you about, yes, this is what we need to do next, what shall I do next, etc. But the person paying for the treatment might be a close relative in the Gulf, but ultimately they decide whether some treatment is going to happen or not, because it's their money. So there are hidden dynamics there. Who talks to whom? There are families where people will not talk to the patriarch, or they will not speak until they're spoken to. And in that case, it's very difficult to have an open communication with that person. Now, if the patient themselves is the person who normally doesn't talk to anyone, but will only direct their decisions or their ideas through someone else, then that becomes even more difficult if the carer is somebody who's perceived to be at a lower hierarchy than the patient himself or herself. And so there's decision making, there's again, cohesiveness, how open the communication channels are. Can you speak your mind to people within your family without being either attacked or ridiculed? There's somebody who's always considered the joker in the family. They're supposed to be the ones to make everybody laugh. Now it's very difficult for them to experience or express their grief, because that's the role that they have always played in the family, right? So communication patterns within the family also influence how the grieving process goes. And of course, going further out, social support is very, very important in the experience of grief. Cohesive families that are engaged with society, who have that social support, who are on good terms with their neighbors, who have a church group that they're very close to and who will come and help with respite care and so on. People who have other parents, their children's friends who they have grown to gotten close to over time. It could be anything really. So social support also determines the whole grieving process and how grief is expressed or not expressed. And as opposed to a closed family that typically does not have anything to do with their immediate neighbors. And today, if you find, in the more metropolitan cities or also in the West especially, you could be living in the same apartment block for decades, but you don't know who your neighbor is. You've never exchanged a word with them. Whereas we see a lot less of that in the Indian context. I mean, and I've heard this a lot where, there's a lot more warmth in the Indian context, and you will find some support at some point, but that may not always be true, especially in the case of, in some cases, especially in the case of women. And I just want to highlight that with some of the cases that we've seen where a young couple has gotten married, and then the husband has had an accident, so he's had spinal cord trauma. He's wheelchair bound. It was an arranged marriage. She has left her town and her home, and she's here now. She's looking after him, and she doesn't really have support of her own, but she's a full-time caregiver. And there have been more than one or two cases where, there's conflict that has arisen between the patient and the caregiver, because she's a young woman and she's now the only one who is able to go out and do things. And the husband thinks that, she's going out and having an affair. That has happened on many, many occasions. And then she also has to cut down on those activities. And then literally she's just alone with her grief, can't express it to anybody. And there's conflict with her husband. So there's various things at play over there. And isolated families, they could be emotionally isolated. They could be geographically isolated. They could have emotionally isolated them from others. They might have had a fallout with their own families because of certain, there are, how many people do we know who've gone against their parents' wishes and gotten married and gone to live somewhere else. And when somebody falls sick, they're unable to get the support of their own families because they never had it in the first place. So there's all kinds of ways in which a family can be isolated from society around them. So continuing on this is a factor, a very important factor that determines grief, or not determines, I would say influences. So all these factors that I've talked about don't determine grief. It's not that if this is there, this is definitely going to happen, but they certainly have an influence over the way the person experiences grief. And individual styles, we've talked about society, we've talked about family, we've talked about systems theory, and coming down to a single individual level, there are three aspects to this. One is, of course, how an individual experiences the grief, how they express that grief, and the two of these eventually lead to how that person adapts to the loss. So the experience of grief, how they're able to express or not express their grief, eventually leads to how they adapt to the loss that they may have already lost or is an anticipatory loss. And this is from Doka and Martin. Again, they're researchers primarily, but a lot of their research is now being put into clinical practice. And there's some very, very good work that they've done. And in fact, a lot of their work started out as gender studies. So initially they wanted to see the difference between men and women and how they grieve. And of course, there was a lot of bias in the past where it was believed that women are the one who like to talk to other women, they like to talk to people, they express their grief emotionally, and all of that chest thumping stuff, whereas men are supposed to be stoic and they don't cry and all of those things. But it was these people who also said that that's quite toxic to look at it like that. And so in their own practice, they had moved from gender studies to defining grief as being sort of masculine ways of expressing grief or feminine ways. And then, as true, I think I have a lot of respect for people who can see the flaws in their own theories and then change it. They eventually realized that that was also not a very healthy way of looking at it, because if a woman showed more masculine ways of expressing grief, was that a bad thing? And very often, we inflict these presumptive stereotypical roles on children also. We tell boys you shouldn't cry, or we tell we don't mind if a girl cries, but if a boy cries, we immediately stop him. So they felt that their research theory was sort of lending itself to that even more. So they came up with this really, what I personally like a lot. They came up with this way of looking at it. So rather than calling it feminine and masculine, they called it intuitive and instrumental. And they said intuitive is more from the heart and instrumental is more from the head. And intuitive people tend to put more of their energy into affect, into emotion, into feeling. They quite readily and spontaneously express their feelings, and they're comfortable sharing their inner experiences. Whereas instrumental people, who are more, for whom that is their primary adaptive strategy, they put more energy into cognitive and intellectual pursuits, and they prefer to discuss problems rather than feelings. And typically, stereotypically, we assign intuitive to women and instrumental to men. But we know a lot of women also may tackle grief in an instrumental way. They might start problem solving. They might start figuring out tasks. They might make sure that everybody is well fed, and all of that. And there are a lot of men who are also intuitive grievers. They might, today more and more, I think, we're coming across men who don't mind talking about their feelings. But earlier it was frowned upon. So there was a clear distinction in gender roles. But now this is how we look at it. And in that Venn diagram in the middle, you see blended, which is heart and head. And there are people who, all of us, have a primary adaptive modality that we comfortably settle into when we experience a crisis. For me, it might be heart. But if I have a blended personality in that sense, then I'm quite comfortable with the secondary, adaptive modality of being instrumental. While I'm more of a feeling-oriented person, I might not really have a problem with going and getting tasks done. And so there's quite a balance between instrumental and intuitive. And then there is a person who is dissonant, where actually they're intuitive people, but because of societal pressure or because of any other kind of prejudice or stereotype, or their own self-imposed sort of behavioral values, they behave in the opposite way. They might be intuitive people, but they force themselves to be task-oriented. Or they might be instrumental people, but they feel like, oh, they have to talk about it. And I find that this is something that all of us who are counselors and psychosocial or mental health providers have to be careful of. Sometimes we go to a patient's family and we force them to vent. We feel that a person will only really cope with their grief if they're able to vent their feelings. But that's not entirely true. You have to sometimes closely watch their activities and their actions, because that might be telling you that person is grieving. So this is a trap that all of us as mental health professionals tend to fall into, where we force people to talk about their feelings. And if they don't, it actually irritates them. We feel that, this person is a difficult person. They have some problems. That may not be the fact of the matter. So this is something interesting for all of you to sort of delve more deeply into. And when you're dealing with people on an individual basis, whether it's the caregiver, whether it's the patient, I will ask that you look at the individual styles and try and see whether they're blended, whether they're dissonant, whether they're more intuitive, whether they're more instrumental, and let's not impose any stereotypes on any of them. Individual styles are likely to solidify by early adolescence. And this has to do with, of course, their socialization patterns, their attachment styles. It has to do with how they received love. And I read this, something beautiful recently, which said that grief really has to do with love. And if you have to understand grief, you have to understand the vagaries of love. Who loves whom, how much they love each other, etc. So that all finally goes into determining the style that the person is most likely to adapt and use for the rest of their lives. And usually we find that these individual styles remain relatively stable right through life. Of course, there are scenarios in which they are, shocked out of their typical coping style. But if all things remain fairly neutral, then their coping styles and individual styles of grieving remain relatively stable. Towards the end of life, this is a Western study, I have to tell you. So this theory talks about people tend to move towards a more blended style. I can't say that I entirely agree with that, because I also feel that sometimes people get a little bit more rigid in their patterns as they grow older. So you might have somebody who was always instrumental, and by the end of their lives is even more instrumental and is actually contemptuous of people who are more intuitive. So, but by and large, I think over the course of their study cohort, they have found that people tend to move towards a more blended style. The bottom statement, it says, a crisis may not be, or it may be an inappropriate time to teach new coping skills. Now, somebody who's had the same coping skills all their lives, when a crisis happens, we as helpers or as care providers shouldn't go in there and try and teach them a brand new coping style immediately in the middle of their crisis. If somebody is going to teach you how to do a new task and you're having a really, really stressful day, chances are you're not going to absorb that task or how to do it. And in fact, it might irritate you that somebody's trying to tell you something. So it's always good to identify what that person's existing strengths are and build on that and work with that. So if somebody is a more instrumental person and is not really into talking about their feelings, fine. So let's see how we can help that person. Can we give them a task to do that will enable them to feel a bit better? Some people love solving problems. So yes, okay, so bring them into that problem solving mode and get them to work through that. So it's very important to understand what their existing strengths are and not just focus on their weaknesses and work with their strengths. Now, there is such a thing called anticipatory grief. And as the name suggests, it is grief that is felt in anticipation of a future harmful occurrence. And this is something that a lot of our patients and families could be feeling at the moment. Something is going to happen. The person might be in remission at the moment, but there's always that feeling that, okay, something bad is about to happen. And once the prognosis is certain, once you know that the person really there's no coming back from the advanced stages of illness, that grief starts to settle in. Very often you're already imagining what life is going to be like without them, and that's what anticipatory grief really is. And it directly relates to the awareness of an impending loss. People are aware. They may not always say it. They might give you the impression that they're in denial. But if you see this grief sort of setting in, they are probably coming to terms with what is around the corner. And at this point, I think it's important to highlight that loss and fear are two sides of the same coin. If you really love something, I would probably, rather than a coin, again, I'd call in a triangle and say loss, fear, and love. Because if you love something, you're afraid of losing it. It could be a pen that you love very much, but you're going to hold on. You're going to make sure you pick it up off that desk and nobody takes it from you. And I've lost a lot of pens I've really loved. And I think I know at least some people in the audience in Trivandrum right now who have a few of those. But it could be something as silly as that, or it could be a pet. It could be a person. It could be something materialistic, but you don't want to lose it. And there may not be this panicky fear that you're going to lose it, but it is there. Think of people who for a moment have lost sight of their children in a market, or they're out of sight. I mean, the fear that sets in instinctively is massive, right? So fear and loss are two sides of the same coin. I think the binding factor there is really love. And this kind of anticipatory grief, the grief that sets in because you're about to lose something, has a lot to do with the fear that the person is feeling. And some of these fears, there could be many more, which I haven't put on this slide, but just the most common ones are fear of the unknown. What's going to happen? How am I going to live my life after this person dies? What am I going to do? What am I going to do without this person's guidance? Where is this person going to be? I mean, what happens after death? Is this it? Is this the end of our relationship? So fear of the unknown, fear of loneliness. I mean, this is, of course, and especially in the case of elderly people, this is a big, big fear, because today more and more older people are being marginalized. A lot of old people are living on their own or in homes. And I remember in Coimbatore, Dr. Alka once made this really, I mean, it was such a great statement. She said, a person can be lonely even when they're surrounded by people, right? And an elderly person is lonely because there's nobody else in that room who really understands them. So fear of loneliness, fear of losing the person who understands you best, that's one fear. Fear of loss of family and friends. Now, this is a fear that goes both ways. The patient who is sick could also be feeling this fear, that I'm going to lose all these people. Now, I remember very clearly when I was young, and I was about to lose somebody, and I was so upset about it. And then someone said to me, "But yeah, imagine what it's like for that person. I mean, you're losing one person, they're losing everyone, and they don't know what's going to happen next." So, fear of loss of family and friends is a big one. Fear of loss of body function. I mean, this is very closely tied into the anxiety that comes around advanced illnesses. A lot of people, if you really get into that conversation with them, you'll find that it's not actually death that they're afraid of. They're more worried about how they're going to die. And are they going to lose control over their bodies? Are they going to lose control over their minds? Is it something that they're going to get humiliated about? And fear of loss of identity, of course. I mean, we talked about this. How do you identify yourself? It's usually by the roles that you play in society. Okay, I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to just probably go through this faster than I want to. But there is such a thing as difficult grief. Grief that is not as simple and straight. I mean, grief is never simple and straightforward, but difficult grief is even more complicated. And while grief is a healthy response, in some situations, complications may arise. And we as palliative care providers need to recognize some of these signs, and then we need to get in professional help. This is not something that we can really sort of deal with on our own. And difficult grief sort of manifests itself in various ways. And three of the most common ways it manifests is in as complicated grief, delayed grief, and disenfranchised grief. So complicated or chronic grief is basically intense and long-lasting grief. Grief that goes beyond the normal, course of time. And what would normally be a natural healing process is derailed by the nature of the relationship of the deceased person who has died. Is it somebody that you were extremely attached to, somebody you were really close to, someone you can't do without? It could also be someone who you had a very difficult relationship with, somebody who probably was an abuser, somebody who probably hurt you, and this person has died. So, there's a lack of closure. Circumstances of the death. How did that person die? Was it unexpected? Were there several deaths that happened that year? Was this not the only death that you experienced? Was it a suicide? Suicide is a really, really difficult form of death to come to terms with. Events that occurred after the death. One of the most common examples I can think of is massive property disputes happening after somebody died. And it completely, throws the family off. Suddenly, siblings who've been close all their lives suddenly find that they're fighting over things assets that were left behind. Something probably that was not done with a lot of respect after the person died, something that went wrong during the funeral. All of these things could cause complicated grief. And basically, complicated grief dominates and overshadows life. You cannot get it out of your head. It's all you think about day in, day out. And then it becomes this chronic sort of thing that you live with. And today, chronic grief is called prolonged grief disorder. And Colin Murray Parks, who's from St. Christopher's Hospice in London, he's an author. He's actually done a lot of research into what is now called prolonged grief disorder. Although it has not yet been admitted, I think, into the DSM, It does share all the characteristics of a mental health disorder, and it can be treatable if it gets the right kind of support. Delayed grief is grief that has been postponed, as the name suggests. And why do you postpone grief? Sometimes when someone dies, there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of practical issues that come up, a lot of sort of, again, property issues that might come up. You have to deal with a lot of financial issues. You have to deal with the kids that are left behind and all of that. So your grief gets interrupted, and then it doesn't really come up till much later. And when it does come up, you don't really tie up the two. Like you might wake up a year later, completely unable to get out of bed, and then you find that, and you can't tie it back to the death of somebody 1 year later, but it could very well just be delayed grief, and it can manifest itself physically. Disenfranchised grief is grief that is considered unacceptable by others, and that is seen in situations where the relationship is not recognized by others because they didn't know you had a close relationship, for starters. It could be an affair that a person is having. It could be a relationship that the rest of the family was not aware of. It could be a close friend that nobody had really met or whatever. It's a relationship that was real, but the family or society did not approve of, such as non-traditional relationships. It could be a person who's in a same-sex relationship, who might be gay, and the other, society or that particular community, it's unacceptable to them. And the way the person died is not as supported as others, like in a drug overdose or a suicide, or in the case of people who have been perpetrators of horrific crime, somebody who's murdered somebody else and then gets sick, and so people who are prisoners, those kind of people. So people who are left behind are disenfranchised. Their grief is not really recognized. And it is also experienced when the loss is not a person. It could be an animal, it could be a pet, it could be a failed marriage, it could be unfulfilled dreams, financial loss, business loss, the loss of a loved one's functioning. So there are all these kinds of things that are not blatantly obvious to everybody else, but that is also a source of grief. Very quickly, I'm not going to get into this too much because there are people who are going to be dealing with depression, but this is something that is very important. Very often we label grief as depression, and that is a mistake we need to stop making. I find that a lot of people in palliative care practice or even another practice will go and in their notes write, person is depressed. There is a difference between grief and depression, and do not label somebody with a mental health condition when it's actually a normal process, a human process that they're experiencing. They might have several common characteristics like intense sadness, fatigue, sleep and appetite disturbances, low energy, loss of pleasure, difficulty concentrating, and overwhelming emotions. These are all common to both grief and depression. But the key difference between grief and depression is that grief, usually people stay connected to others. They will still, they look for comfort. They periodically experience pleasure. They might laugh, they might remember, have a good memory, and they continue to functioning as they rebuild their lives. But with depression, there's a loss of connection with others and the ability to experience even brief periods of pleasure. A person who is severely depressed is unable to connect with anybody else in that way. And finally, the DSM-4, the fourth edition, did not even, the DSM, by the way, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders, which is the Bible of most psychological practice, psychiatric practice. It did not permit the diagnosis of major depression to be made within 2 months of bereavement unless people are seriously impaired or at risk for suicide. So after Chitra has talked to you about depression, I will urge you all to please make this distinction when you talk to your patients and caregivers, and don't outright label them as having depression. Although bereavement can trigger depression and other mental health disorders, some people start suffering anxiety, they have panic attacks or turn into alcoholics. But in most cases, you will find that these issues were evident from before the crisis. So finally, what can palliative care providers do? Firstly, you can encourage questions, suggest writing them down, and you have to give good, clear information as many times as required. Don't get impatient. When people are grieving, they aren't able to process information clearly, so they might come and ask you the same question over and over again. Don't hesitate to give that same, and make sure you're being clear. Make sure your language is not confusing. talk to more than one family member. This is very important. Very often you will talk to only the primary caregiver and you feel that the picture they've given you is the whole picture. That may not actually be true. You have to corroborate it and treat it like a jigsaw puzzle, not suspiciously, but just to put the pieces together, and then you get a holistic view of what is happening. Allow time for information to be absorbed. When you give information to someone, don't expect them to understand it off the cuff. Give them some space. Come back to them later. Say, did you understand what I said? Do you have any questions about it? You have to acknowledge emotions, even anger. We walk away from issues that are uncomfortable for us. But acknowledging emotions is not just acknowledging somebody's sadness and pain. It is also acknowledging when they're upset and when they're angry. And you can say to them, I know you're angry right now, and this must be a really, really frustrating and difficult time for you, but I'm here for you. Okay, so, and don't take emotional responses personally. If somebody lashes out at you and says, your hospital has done this to us, or your organization failed us, there's no need to take it personally. It's a very difficult time emotionally for them. And things will change if you don't get engaged in that aggravated sort of interaction. And finally, while you're dealing with a grieving person, remember that your behavior is more important than your words. We don't always have the right words, by the way, so you can convey your empathy by your actions. Be aware of your own feelings and how you deal with death. And this is an exercise we do with anybody coming into our training, which is, have you ever thought about your own death? How would you like to die? Who you want around you at that point? And I think that's an important exercise for all of us who are working in this field to do, because if you are terrified of death, then you're probably not going to be of a lot of use to somebody who's going through something as serious as this. Be patient. Listening, of course, is the most important skill. Don't overprotect or hurry people. We tend to overprotect people and we tell them, no, it's going to be okay. It's going to be fine. It's not. So don't say words that you feel like you're shielding them from reality. And help people find their own solutions to problems. Don't give them your solution, which is, I think, a very, very important thing. Sometimes we think that because we've had all this experience, we're in a better place to tell them what to do, but people need to find their own solutions. You're just a catalyst. And please don't tell them what they should or shouldn't be feeling. Oh no, don't say that. That's not, you'll be fine. I mean, we do that quite often. So don't tell them what they should or shouldn't be feeling or saying. And certainly don't compare their grief to the experiences of others or yourself. If somebody is telling you about their grief, don't say, oh, the same thing happened to me and this is how don't make it about yourself and don't make it about others. It's very disrespectful. Always keep it to the person that you are dealing with. And if you are going to offer to help them in some way, be very clear about it. And if you offer to help, make sure you do it. Don't offer something just in that moment to make, just to say something. Be very clear about the capacity of yourself and your organization of what you can and cannot do for that person. And if you do promise it to them, deliver. And always be aware that there are cultural differences. Somebody may not respond emotionally to you as you would, but that doesn't make it not right. And when there are grieving difficulties, when something feels like it needs more professional help, ask for it, get it. Don't try and solve it on your own. People run the risk of suicide. People run the risk of hurting themselves or other people. If you feel any of those signs are showing up, please call in somebody that is more qualified to help with that. And finally, I'm going to end with this. Hold space really just means just being present for somebody. And I think the last one is something that we all need to remember. Sometimes silence is what is needed. You don't always have to know what to say. So I will stop. Raju, I'm terribly sorry I've overshot. And
thank you so much, ma'am. So this is a time, even though we can have 3 to 5 minutes for clarifying if you have any doubts, any questions. Yeah, Pranab Kumar sir, please. Always first. Please proceed, sir.
Thanks, SMRITI Rana, ma'am. One thing I can tell you that sometimes when someone we love dies after a long and painful illness, we may primarily be thankful that he or she is suffering, his suffering has ended, although we are in pain. To my experience, I actually wanted my wife to be sent off, because she was suffering horrendous pain at the end of her life. So this is one thing, whether I was right or whether it is right to thank that his suffering or her suffering has ended. Another thing that grief is that it is related to Siti ma'am's version that grief is associated with love. So this anticipatory grief, uh, this relates to the anticipatory grief. So we want to be ended with the suffering, isn't it? Am I wrong?
You're absolutely not wrong, and I'm so thankful to you for bringing that up. And firstly, it takes a lot of courage to say that on a forum like this. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
I have had the same experience where after someone I loved very, very much suffered a lot, I was relieved when they died.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
And that is something that I feel all of us, it's so important to hear that. And I am actually appalled that I did not put that in my presentation, but thanks to you, it's there now. That when somebody feels relief when a loved one dies, we as helpers, we should not say, no, don't disqualify that feeling. It is as honorable a feeling as no, it is an honorable feeling because that shows how much you love them. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I'm actually going to incorporate that in that presentation the next time.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir, for raising that. Any other questions? Anyone is needed any clarification on the presentation? Please come. You can raise your hand and we can unmute you.
Vaishnavi, I think I'll add that, especially towards the end, I really sped through it. Like I said in the beginning, grief is such a massive, massive topic, and it would take many years to actually cover everything. But I'm happy to take any questions. If anyone can think of something later, once we've shared the learning outcomes as well, you're welcome to write in, and I'll be happy to help.
Great. Thank you so much, ma'am. So I think we can move ahead with the case presentation. So Vidisha is going to present the case, and she is working as a social worker cum counselor in Department of Palliative Care Medicine in Dr. Bora Cancer Institute, Assam. So thank you, Vidisha, for taking this task, and over to you.
Hi everyone. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll be presenting this case. Okay. Let's just give this patient name this patient as Mrs. D. So she is an 48 years old woman, and she has recently passed away. She has passed away on 30th of July 2019. So the medications that she were on were morphine, that was for pain, then bronchodilator, darifilin, that was for breathing difficulty that she was going through, analgesic, laxative, fluconazole, and of course there was this Riles tube was there, and Foley's catheter, and she was also on a diet chart that was given to her by our doctors. Next slide. Okay, so this is the genogram, and okay, I'll be explaining to you. The one that has the circle that has been, darkened and it has been crossed. So that is the patient. So it has been darkened because she was the patient, and crossed because she's dead now. And the rest is that her family consisted of her husband and like her husband, and of course she had a daughter and a son. And on her side of the family, she had 3 brothers and 3 sisters, and her father is dead, and she had her mother. And on her husband's side, he had two brothers and one sisters, and of course he also lost his father, and his mother was there. And you can see that I have given this dotted line from the patient and her daughter. Well, that's because the relation between both of them was not that strong as mother and daughter. We saw that the relation between them was not that strong as it should have been. The next slide. Okay, so this is basically the case, the illness history, and the health system that she had been through. So the patient had pain from starting itself, and then spot appeared on her tongue. So, and the patient couldn't have anything, she couldn't even have water. So at first the family, they consulted a family doctor, and it was a family doctor who advised them to go to Northeast Cancer Institute. So in Northeast Cancer Institute, they consulted a doctor who's let's name his Dr. M. So Dr. M had this operation done on this patient, and also the patient had received 5 cycles of chemotherapy. So, but then actually the patient was she was to receive 6 cycle, but then after 5 cycles she became very weak, and she became very she couldn't take anything, and she couldn't have anything, and she was very weak. So at that point, the patient's husband, he went to the Dr. M, and then he consulted the doctor. But then the behavior of the Dr. M was not that good, and the attendant, I mean the caregiver, didn't like the attitude of the doctor. The doctor was very vaguely, I mean, he when the caregiver asked, my patient has become very weak, and doctor, what can be done, or will she be able to take the 6th cycle of chemotherapy or not? The caregiver was very conscious about all these things, but then the doctor very vaguely and very he was not interested in replying. He just vaguely replied, whenever she gets well, and whenever she's healthy, just bring her, and just bring her. So like by what the doctor said, it was he meant if she gets well, just bring her, and if she doesn't get well, then like I can't help. It was some sort of like through his speech, the caregiver could assume that he meant something like that. So the caregiver didn't actually want to continue the treatment over there in Northeast Cancer Institute. And so it was then that he brought her to Dr. B. Borua Cancer Institute, and the patient also received chemotherapy over here in our institute, and her palliative treatment started from 2nd April 2019. And also since the patient was from our a nearby place, so she was registered for the home care service that is going on in our palliative department, and a total of 10 visits have been made to the patient, from the time she had registered herself under the home care, a home care service. 10 number of visits have been made to the patient. The next slide. Okay, so this is the family history. As I have already said, in the genogram, I have already pointed out that the patient lived with her husband and the 2 children, the daughter and the son. The daughter is the eldest one, and the son is the younger one. And it was basically the husband and the son who looked after her. That's because the daughter was very much I won't say that it's bad or it's something like it shouldn't be, but the daughter was very much career focused. I mean, she did not give much time to her mother. And like when we asked, okay, how much time do you give, like whenever we used to go to her place for the home care service. We used to talk to her, and we asked the doctor, how much time do you give to your mom? And because she's at that stage, I mean, she's a terminally ill patient, and so how much time do you give? Because she was at her home, I mean, she didn't work or something like that. So she said that out of 24 hours I only give 15 minutes to my mother. And then we asked, like, why only 15 minutes? And her only answer to that was, I don't have time. I'm busy. I don't have time, I'm busy. So we also tried to tell her ki, see the condition of your mom, you can see what your mom is going through, and of course, yeah, you can well understand what the consequences will be, or that you won't get your, once she is gone, you won't get her back again. So why can't you give her more time? Why only 15 minutes? The only answer to her, to that question, or any question that we asked, was that I don't have time, and I'm busy. So that was what the daughter replied. Well, other than that, we also noticed the husband did not allow the patient to speak much, and to express herself. Like when the first visit was made, whenever we tried to talk with the patient, the caregiver, I mean her husband, would always interrupt. He would always, if the patient wanted to say anything, he would always interfere, and he would start giving the answers. So to that, we, like, once we had to tell the husband, I mean the caregiver, ki, please let her speak, let her just express her views and her what she's going through, or what is her feeling. So from that day onwards, it was on our second or third visit that we had to tell the husband about that. And so from that day, the patient was allowed to speak, and to express her feelings and her views. Next slide. Social challenges were, it was basically, they did not allow their neighbors to know about the diagnosis and anything, because they have, like, as when we had talked, so we came to know, okay, the neighbors make a fuss out of everything. I mean, if even if it's a small thing, they would just spread it in a different manner, and they would make a I mean, they would just spread it, and they would not say anything good about it, about the disease or something, and they would just make up things and all. So actually, it was because of all these things that they did not, allow their neighbors to know about the diagnosis or the prognosis, or what the patient is going through, or anything of that sort. Social support available is, of course, they had the social support of their respective family members. Like from the husband side, he had received all the support, and also from the patient side. So Mrs. D's family members, her mother and her brothers, sisters, all have supported the family, the patient and her husband, and both the children as well. So they have received that. They had the family support, and also our palliative team had supported them in every way possible. So yeah, next slide. Financial condition, of course, as we could see that their financial condition was not that poor, and they were financially quite okay, and they did not face any such kind of financial issues. So they didn't have any debts or loans. But the schemes and subsidies that were available, or that is going on, is one is Atal Amrit Abhiyan, and then it's Chief Minister Relief Fund, and Surit. Surit is the MLA fund, and the patient had accessed Atal Amrit Abhiyan and Chief Minister Relief Fund. So both these schemes were taken up by the patient, or where this, I mean, the every bit, I mean, the sorry, I mean, they had access to these schemes. Next slide. Educational status, the daughter was doing her MBA, and the son was doing his graduation. And the daughter had actually completed her MBA, and she was at home. So when we went for the home visits, so she was at her place. And job status of family members is, the husband did business, but but when the patient was, I mean, when the wife felt ill, so he had stopped his business, and even the patient did some business. She was involved in some kind of business, but then later when she was diagnosed, so she also stopped doing her job, but they were financially quite okay. Next slide. Patient's insight on diagnosis and prognosis. Yes, the patient was well aware about her diagnosis and about her prognosis as well. Caregivers' insight on diagnosis is yes, all the caregivers, I mean the family members, each and everyone, they were aware about the diagnosis and about the prognosis of the patient. Mental status examination, the components and this patient and the caregiver. Appearance wise, of course, the patient was not that well nourished. She looked very pale and very weak. And dressing wise, she was well dressed and she was very much alert, very much cooperative with the examiner. And as that of the caregivers were quite well nourished, alert, well dressed, anxious but also calm and very cooperative. Behavior wise, the patient, whenever we used to talk with her, she used to maintain an eye contact, and movement was there, but later she became bedridden. So initially she the movement was there, but then uh, later on she became bedridden and she couldn't move. Caregiver, of course, they maintained eye contact, and normal psychomotor activities and movement was there. Speech of the patient is the patient did not talk much, and she used to remain quiet. It was only occasionally that whenever we used to ask something, she just used to reply, and she then after that she used to keep quiet. It was not more than what we asked that she would say or she would express. She would only say as much as we asked. That's it. The caregiver's speech rate was normal, and volume was also quite normal. But then, of course, the patient used to, the caregiver used to talk a lot. More than the patient, the caregiver used to talk a lot. Mood and effect. Of course, the patient was sad, and I think I shouldn't use this word depressed, but she looked like that because she didn't talk much, and she used to kind of just stay, with just herself. Even with the family members also, she didn't talk much. So that's why I had used this. And of course, the caregiver was the mood and effect. It was normal because they had accepted the condition or the diagnosis and prognosis of the patient. So they had very well accepted it, and they was quite ready for the thing that was coming up. Thought process was organized for both the patient and caregiver. Thought content was normal. Uh, Cognition was for the patient, was conscious and oriented, and also for the caregiver it was conscious and oriented. Insight for both the patient and the caregivers, it was normal. Next slide. Okay, so psychosocial assessment was that the patient and the family members, they were very religious people, and they followed Gita very intensely, and they said they had gained strength from it. By following Bhagavad Gita, they had gained strength from it. And also we had observed though the patient didn't talk much, or she used to stay with herself and all, but she had that inner strength within her. She had that strength. And it was also that the second thing was that the patient though fought against the disease, as I said, that she had that inner strength, and she fought against the disease very bravely. She didn't give up. She was very much, we could see that. But then she was sad because of her daughter, who did not give time, as I have already explained. The daughter did not give time and even did not care for her. It was only 15 minutes, but then the rest of the hours she used to just not even go near her mother, and just maybe just sit next to her. It's not necessary that we always need to talk to the patient. Every time we are near the patient, we need to talk to them. It's not that, but we can just sit and maybe hold their hand, and they would receive that comfort. But then the daughter didn't do anything like that, and she was all to herself. I mean, just giving more emphasis on her career and all, and did not care for her. And she was also very practical about things. Like we could, whenever like when we talked with her, we could find out that she was very practical. She was like, yeah, I know that I might not be able to see my mom again or something like that, but then I don't have time, and so that's why I just give 15 minutes. So that was basically what she told us. And also the husband's behavior was quite like it I could we could make out that there was something that he was trying to maybe hide. And because whenever we tried to talk with the patient, he was the one to interrupt. And also at the first place, he showed that everything was good and everything was very perfect in his place. And the patient was being taken care of, and everyone loved her. And also everyone have accepted the condition, or the situation, or the thing that is going to come up. But then later on, when we talked, and when we visited the place more and more often, we got to know that, of course, not everything is perfect, because the daughter's attitude towards the mother is not good. I mean, she doesn't give time, and also, of course, it's not perfect as he tried to show. And also the patient always kind of since he talked much, so it was always like he tried to hide something. It was always like that we have always felt. And but then later when we so we later when we asked the patient to speak, and it was the patient that had informed us about her daughter, that she doesn't talk with me and all. So, and the mother, I mean, the patient had actually requested us that kindly talk to my daughter, and please tell her to give me some time, and maybe just sit next to me. And that was her wish. That was the wish of the of the patient, that I really want my daughter, that she talk that she can speak to me and spends some time with me. But the father didn't tell us that. But only after the patient told us that the husband or the caregiver also told us, yeah, my daughter does not give much time to my to my wife, and that kindly talk to her, or just try to make her understand that she needs to give time to her mother. So it was only at that point of time that he told us. But earlier he didn't tell anything of that sort, and he was always showing everything is good and everything is very perfect in his place. So next slide. So the goals of psychosocial care is, of course, as of now, bereavement counseling, which is being done and is continuing. And also, this is something like I really want to understand why the daughter's behavior was like that. And because she was everyone is quite a some amount or other are each one of us are practical in life. I mean, that is very common. But her behavior, her outlook towards her life was the practicality that she hold was something beyond I could imagine. Because that was her mother. I mean, it was no one else, her mother. But she was so much practical and so much into her career that she didn't give time to her mom. So I really want to understand that why what was the reason. Because she didn't give much time to us, of course. So whenever we visited her during the home visit, she didn't give much time, so we didn't get to talk much with her. But then I really want to talk more with her to understand why was her behavior like that. So I really want to understand that because I feel there was something more than what she told us. And maybe there was something beyond that. And she was also very close to her father. than her mom. So of course there might have been something, but I really want to understand her behavior. I really want to understand why her behavior towards her mom was like that. Next. Yeah, so it's a summary. A 48 years old female with CA tongue, with secondary neck node, who breathed her last on the 30th 7 2019. Next. Discussion points, of course, I would like to know how to make the communication more effective in this situation where this family member is, not ready to talk much with you, and that member is and when that member is also an important person in the patient's life, because in this situation the daughter was very much important to her mother, but then she was not ready to talk with her mom, and of course when we tried to talk with her, she also didn't give time to us. But then how to handle such situation, or how to make this communication with such kind of people more effective, or how to communicate with them, and also how to make bereavement support more effective. So that's it. Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Vidisha. So I think this particular session needs some more time. I would like to request all of you to, if possible, can we extend for 10 more minutes? If yes, please raise your hands. Yeah, so most of them agrees. So Smriti ma'am, what's your opinion? I think we need more time to discuss on especially this case presentation as well as the first session also.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so any questions regarding the presentation? Pranab sir,
Sir, have you raised your hand?
Not that.
okay, so Dev Tirtha, please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hello. So you are asking about the presentation or the case study? Because I have a question about presentation also,
Please
or
proceed.
about the case study also.
Yeah. Both you can raise.
Okay. The question, yeah, my question is to first to Smriti ma'am about the case presentation. So ma'am, you have told that about the factors influence about the grief. Under that there was a attachment styles. So does the attachment only with the person or also with the like sometimes what happens if a person is a singer, so and if that person has a laryngeal cancer, so he or she may have lost their voice, but she or he may be attached with her profession with a singer because she has a dream of she loves singing. So she may be attached with the profession also, right? So does the attachment styles only involved with the individual person, or was with also with the hobby or with some profession also?
Thanks, Devtita. No, in the case of attachment styles and the whole theory, we're talking specifically about human relationships. Specifically about human relationships. We are not talking about your passion for your work or stuff. Although the way you attach or don't attach, or attach, in an unhealthy way, does not just determine your attachment patterns to the people closest to you, like in family, but it also affects your interaction with people in life in general. So in that regard, I suppose it does have an impact on your profession and your hobbies and things and the people that you encounter. But no, attachment theory and attachment disorders particularly only talks about human attachment patterns.
Thank you, ma'am. That was for my question for the case presentation. So my for the case study, can I ask now?
Yes.
Yeah. I may have a network problem, but I will try. But the thing is that thanks, Vidisha, for sharing your case. Um, my question is that what was the relationship between you and the patient husband? It was a trusted relationship between you and the patient, because now you have told that you have visited 10 times. So what was the relationship between you and the patient husband?
Yeah. The relationship between me and the patient husband was that it was quite good, since as I have already said, we have visited 10 times. So it was good. Like he told us everything, or he shared with us. But also, though he shared everything with us, and but at some point, at some point I always felt he might be not sharing everything, as he showed that he shared everything. But then at some point, by the way he talks, or maybe the by the expressions or that he makes, I could make out that he was hiding something. But then I always tried to talk with him more and more, so that I could just uh, take take out all the informations from him. But then maybe I should also continue doing that more, to understand more of him. But maybe 10 visits was not sufficient to understand a person. So of course I'm trying more and more. But then of course the relation was not that bad, or it was not that it was a cordial relation between the husband and me.
Thank you. So, any other questions?
Hello.
Hello.
You can hear?
Yes, yes. Do you have
Yeah.
any questions more?
Yeah, I do have only one thing. After when the husband told the team about that, yes, about that mother is worried because her daughter didn't talk to her. So, do you ask the reason to the husband why the daughter not talk to her?
uh, yeah, like when first, so the patient had told us, please ask my
Hmm.
doctor to give me more time, because she doesn't spend much time with me, and she doesn't talk with me, and the relationship is not that good. So after that, only the husband informed us that yes, it is like that. So we had asked him. So his only reply was that from before, my daughter is close with me, but not with her mother. I mean, that was the only reply that he gave. So we also tried to ask that why is it like that? I mean, why that she is okay. It sometimes happen ki, a child is more close to one of the parent, like maybe either the father or the mother. But then at this point of time, well, that's a different thing. But at this point of time, when the mother is going through, a disease, that she's not well and she's bedridden, uh, even now, why is this thing happening, that the doctor is not giving her time and is close to you but not to the mother? So we also tried to inquire that, but his only reply was that no, it's only from before that she is close to me and not to the mother. So that was the only reply that he gave us. And even to the daughter, when we asked, she said ki, yeah, no, I give 15 minutes to my mom, but then I don't have time to give more than that to my mother, because I'm very busy.
Okay,
And
thank you.
yeah.
Thank you,
Okay.
Ritika.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Smriti ma'am, would you like to add something? Yeah.
A couple of things. One is that I think, okay, so it's very difficult for me to really give a very assertive sort of answer or a comment on this, but just going by what was described, it seemed to me that the father is the decision maker, and he's the person like really in control of the family and stuff like that. If he's the one who's speaking on behalf of the patient, and you had to actually ask him to let her speak and stuff. One is, what I would do is, firstly, rather than asking why questions, I would ask landscape questions. Why question can make the other person defensive. Like if you say, why is the daughter not talking to her mother? Why are you not talking to your mother? Why are you spending only 15 minutes? It automatically puts the other person in a defensive mode, and they feel like they have to, give you some sort of an appropriate answer. Landscape questions are more about, so if I mean, I would have asked her, okay, if you had a problem in school, who would you talk to? Whose advice would you take? So try and understand the landscape and join the dots yourself, rather than expecting them to give you a direct answer. Very often a direct why question really just scares them. It feels like an interrogation. So a landscape question would also involve asking other, like one of the things I'd mentioned in my presentation is talk to more than one family member. Who here has spoken to the brother about the relationship between the parents and the daughter? You only have the father's word that the daughter is close to him. You don't have the brother's opinion on it, and you don't have her opinion on it. Now, even closeness, you can ask landscape questions about closeness. Rather than saying, are you closer to your mother than you were to your father than you were close to your mother? Find ways to define that closeness and say, okay, if you were having a bad day, would you tell your mother about it? Or if she says, no, I would have told my dad about it. Things like that. Secondly, the other thing, if you're going to be continuing this conversation with her, is a good place to explore is what their relationship was like before she fell sick. Were they always disengaged from one another? Were they always like this? Did she never have time for her mother? And if that is so, maybe she needs to be spoken to a little bit more about why she felt the distance from her mother. Was her mother not an emotionally available person to her? See, very often we expect that when a parent is sick, the child has to stand up and serve the parent's needs. But there is a huge history. And for a child to be so disengaged at a time when her mother is visibly so unwell and asking, see, also what happens is people who've been ambivalent towards their children all their lives suddenly expect that as parents, when they're sick, that their children should step up to attention. That's not how it works. There are also cultural expectations we have. We expect that a mother-child relationship is going to be a loving one. That's not true. There are very, very difficult relationships out there. And there are very often same-sex relationships, like a son and the father will have conflict. A daughter and a mother may have emotional issues. And unless we understand that, we are not going to get any sort of straightforward answers as to why at the time of the illness. Like I said, when a family is dysfunctional prior to the illness, the dysfunction only gets magnified once the crisis comes in. So I would go back to their history a little bit, ask a lot of landscape questions to understand where this might be coming from. And if the father is as dominant, then he's not the one I'm going to ask those landscape questions to, right? And also the other thing I would want to know is, in those 15 minutes that she spent with her mother out of 24 hours, what were those 15 minutes like? What did she do in those 15 minutes? Here we are focusing on what she didn't do. What did she do? When she was sitting there for those 15 minutes, did she talk to her mother? Did she hold her mother's hand? And she might very well just be an instrumental person who is cognitively working through her, like if she's been career oriented and stuff, maybe she's just a more cognitive than an emotional person. Or the other thing could be that her grief is so big that she doesn't know how to deal with it. And so she avoids it. A lot of people will avoid grief. They don't know how to deal with it. So they just avoid being around that person because they don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. So there could be several reasons to this. And asking those landscape questions will probably help you to win her over and get her to open up. And I would definitely talk to the brother a little bit more, because at the moment he just seems like someone, I mean, I haven't heard him being mentioned in the presentation at all. So I'd like his opinion on a few things. Yeah.
Yeah, Vidisha, please.
Thank you, ma'am, and I will surely look into these aspects as as you have advised, and I would surely ask more landscape questions than why and how. So thank you so much, ma'am.
You're welcome. And one more thing I wanted to add, please don't
Yes,
feel bad about using the word depressed in the mental status examination. We all do it. I would, going forward, perhaps another word would be disengaged. She's affectively disengaged. So that saves us labeling them depressed, but at the same time, we're describing what they're doing.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Anyone needs further clarifications? Please raise your hand. Runa, would you like to say something? So I think, yeah, Runa?
Yeah, I want to ask Smriti ma'am. Sometimes patient family question as has been years since my loved one's death. Why don't I feel better? what I
That's a very difficult question to answer. um, and the answer is not, I don't know if the answer is something that we can give them. I mean, there seems to me, it sounds like there are so many layers to that. So it would be, what do you mean by feeling better? What does feeling better look like? And let them describe to you what feeling better means. To me, feeling better means like getting out of bed and, like being able to go out and get back to work and meeting my friends, having a nice time. Or it could mean just, going back to doing my old hobbies. So feeling better means different things to different people. So rather than focusing on giving them a solution or an answer to that question, because there's no, I think, definitive answer to that, I would just keep the conversation going and help them untangle what feeling better looks like to them, and perhaps then set short, small, achievable goals. Okay, if feeling better means getting back into feeling connected to your friends and stuff. Okay, when was the last time you met them? Have you reached out to them? What has your last conversation with your friend been like? No, it upset me to talk to them. Why did it upset you? No, because they're behaving like I should move on. So that's going to tell you what it really is. So I feel like it's not a one-time conversation. It's several conversations, and every time you have a conversation, it'll show you a little bit more about them. The fact that they're asking this question means they want to get better, right? So that's but then again, if it's been, when they say several years, then look out for depression, look out for complications in actual mental health, and I would actually also ask about suicidal ideation and stuff like that. Is there any self-harm? Are they drinking? Have they started using a lot more alcohol? Because also sometimes what happens is, out of grief, if they start drinking and stuff, that further depresses their mood. So look into those aspects. If it has been a long time and they haven't been able to re-engage with life, you might need to bring in a more qualified psychologist or a psychiatrist into the picture. But yeah, so start with asking them what feeling better means to them.
Thank you, ma'am. So, any further questions? Pranav Kumar sir, please.
Thanks, Vidisha, for your nice presentation. But one thing I can guess that mother was feeling loneliness, and at this time, in this situation, the patient feels lonely and they want company. But my query is that what about her son's role in giving company to her mother, to his mother? The same as sister or something different?
Okay. Yes, sir. So, sir, the son used to give time to her mother. So there was no issue between the son and the mother. Like as I said, the son and the father. I mean, they were the, I could say that the sole caregivers of the patient. The issue was only with the daughter. So the son was okay with his mom, and there was no issue. He used to take care of her and talk with her and all. But then it was only with the daughter.
Just a last comment, Vaishnavi and Raju, before I think it's time up, is I think it's very important for us as care providers not to put someone on the spot and make them feel guilty for doing or not doing something. Because all of us have our own internal journeys in grief, right? So to constantly try to find out, why didn't you do this? Why? I mean, I would imagine that's only going to make her feel more isolated and disengaged from all of you. So try and avoid even, so right now, to me visually, it almost seems like everybody against her, trying to figure out why were you not there, So I think that's something that we should actively and consciously avoid doing. And because I think, and just one thing is that with our best intentions, we as the healthcare providers inflict guilt. We make people feel guilty. because we're trying to get an answer out of them that we think is the right answer, and that's not the way to do it. And going back to what the father said about a very, very important point that we seem to have skimmed over is what that doctor in the earlier hospital was vague. This is a very, very important point, which came back in the last part of my presentation. Give clear information and only offer what you can do, and do it. Once you've offered to do something, do it. Don't delay it, don't postpone it, don't avoid it. So that one incident has really, really affected this man. And that is something we should all be really clear that we don't repeat the same mistake in the care that we provide. So I just wanted to just signpost that.
So, yeah, thank you all. Thank you all for staying till 4:45. But this is an important topic. We need to discuss more. That's why we have extended the time. Thank you so much for your cooperation. And Smriti ma'am, thank you so much for explaining all the points really well. And it is yet another wonderful presentation from you. Thank you so much. And Vidisha, we look forward to hear from you more. For all the participants, thank you so much. We'll see you soon.
See you on next Friday with a topic on dignity therapy taken by Dr. Seema Rao. So if you have any doubts which is uncleared yet, please write to us. So thank you. Bye.